Hi, you guys. Welcome back to another pretty exciting history lesson here. I'm your history professor, Professor Tracy Daniel. And in this week, we'll be talking about the progressive era. So, chapter 18, the progressive era. So, let's go ahead and dive in. But before we dive in, just a little housekeeping. I do have dogs. So, if they start to bark, I will do my best to ignore them. So please do your best to ignore them as well. But okay, the progressive era, let's get started. So, a few progressive era facts. So, for one, when is this era? The progressive era makes up the first two decades of the 20th century. It's marked by huge economic expansion as well as the creation of new jobs. The progressive era is also, or during this era, we see a rise in immigration to America. So we'll talk about that. We also see the rapid expansion of cities. But with all of these things, we will also see severe inequality and the labor strife that really began during the Gilded Age that we talked about. We really see some of that come to a head because there is persistent labor strife during the progressive era. So during this era, as I said, it's marked by a lot of economic growth. You have increased industrial production as well as rapid population growth and expansion of the consumer marketplace. However, there are stark urban inequalities. So, for example, JP Morgan's financial firm either directly or indirectly controlled about 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the United States, while about a third of the nation's mining and manufacturing workers lived in poverty. And that is a sad fact of the progressive era. But it's also during this time when we have journalists who will begin to highlight these stories and they'll begin to expose some of the ills of industrial life. They'll start to talk about what workers face, and they'll also expose some of the ills of urban life. These journalists are known as muckrakers, okay? It's also during this time that we get rapid immigration. This is a peak of immigration to the United States. Between 1901 and World War I in Europe in 1914, about 13 million immigrants will come to the United States. Most of them will be from Italy, Russia, and the Austro Hungarian Empire. But why are these people coming to America? Well, there are many causes. Many are fleeing poverty, illiteracy, taxation, declining economies in their homelands, as well as political turmoil. Many immigrants who come to the United States will enter through Ellis Island. However, that's not the only port of entry. We'll also have a number of immigrants come from Mexico between 1900 and about 1930. About 1 million Mexicans will enter the United States. So they are some of our first immigrants. America during this time for many immigrants is seen as a land of opportunity and a land of freedom. However, when they got to America, it's not like it was the great American melting pot, right? They often clustered in small, close knit ethnic neighborhoods where they had their own shops and theaters and community organizations and churches. I like to think of America during this time as less of a melting pot and more like an elementary school cafeteria tray, where you have people who cluster with people who speak the same language as them and who have the same customs as them. Many immigrants who will come to America at this time, remember, they're coming to America in an era where there is no workplace protection, where you don't really have, or where there is no minimum wage, right? And so they face low wages, long hours, and incredibly dangerous working conditions. If you can recall from a couple of lectures ago, Between 1880 and 1900, approximately 35,000 workers died every year just in workplace accidents. So, a lot of these factories were actually very dangerous places to work where you don't have a lot of job security. And if anything happens to you while you're at work, you are you're out of luck, really. It's also during this time that we get another, I would call him kind of baron of industry. We get Henry Ford, and we start to see Fordism in the workplace. Fordism is an economic system that was based on mass production and mass consumption. So, Henry Ford had a factory in Highland Park, Michigan, where in 1913, this factory adapted the moving assembly line. So it reduced the production time and led to greater production output. So essentially, you would have a worker, and if that worker's job was to screw lug nuts on tires in the car, that is what the worker did all day. That is what they did. That was their job. While it made work go very quick, or made the production go really quick, one of the cons is that it's really, really monotonous work. But one good thing that Henry Ford did was kind of raise the wage. So during this time, Henry Ford paid his workers a wage of $5 a day. However, Henry Ford was not, I would say, he was not a man who was for unions. So, did his workers have a lot of freedom? Judge for yourselves. So, for one, Henry Ford hired armed detectives to go to the factory floor and spy on his workers in order to prevent them from unionizing. So, that is one of the cons. But Henry Ford did believe that if workers are producing something, they should be able to afford what they are producing in that factory. So he raised the wage to $5 a day. And this is where we get the idea of what is a living wage? How much should workers be paid? What rights should workers have? And it's during this time that we get the idea of there being an American standard of living. The consumer economy gave rise to the idea of a living wage and that American standard of living. And that's something that we're still debating even today. What is a living wage? Here in Texas, the minimum wage, if I'm not mistaken, is $7.25 an hour. Is that a living wage? Can you survive off of this? Can you pay rent off of this, right? And so these are some of the questions that workers even then were asking. Can I live off of what I'm being paid? And this is a question that a priest thought of as well. And in 1906, he wrote a book called A Living Wage. This priest's name was Father John A. Ryan. And in this book, he says that a decent standard of living is a right of American citizenship. Industrial freedom, the idea of what should we be paid, what do workers deserve to be paid, what rights do workers have, that is a question that will be asked, honestly, repeatedly in the progressive era. Large firms, of course, wanted greater control over the work and production process. And so workers will experience a huge loss of freedom. It was the idea of these firms that the job of the worker, or what the worker is supposed to do, is obey their supervisors. And the lack of industrial freedom, it was really at the root of the labor problem. What is industrial freedom? Industrial freedom is the idea that workers can participate in the economic decision making via or economic decision making of the company via having strong unions. And what would this look like? What is the damage in not having a strong union? So, in your module this week, I included a video on a pretty historic event called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. It occurred during the Progressive Era. So, I want you guys to look this up in your module, but I will give a small, very short overview of this. During this time, women who worked in factories, a lot of them would work in textile factories. And by women, I'm meaning teenagers on up. During this time, if you lived in an urban city, if you worked in an urban city, it was usually very important that everyone in the family work because that was the way that the family survived. And so shirtwaists were these very popular shirts that women would wear during this time. The factory or the fire begins when someone more than likely was smoking a cigarette and they tossed the cigarette out and it fell into cotton scraps, causing a fire to go up to the factory. Unfortunately, the elevator broke before being able to get women out. And in order to make sure that these women worked all the time, a lot of the time the factory doors were locked to prevent them from leaving, to make sure that they were working. A number of women will jump to their deaths. Other women will simply be burned alive. And so that really brings, I would say, society's attention to the problems of industrial freedom. This is at a time where buildings were not required to have sprinklers, sprinkler systems. Buildings, there were no workplace provisions or laws to ensure that your workers were safe. And a lot of the times that ended up uh, really with devastating results for the workers. It's also during this period where you have industrial freedom as a rallying cry, economic freedom as a rallying cry, that you start to see a larger socialist presence in American politics. The American Socialist Party was founded in 1901, and by 1912, they boasted about 150,000 members. They really called for a number of immediate reforms. And whenever I do back when I was able to teach in person, one of the projects that I would have my students do, or in class projects that I would have my students do, would have them to I would have them to participate in the election of 1912, and I would put down platforms and they would choose who they voted for. And a number of my students actually ended up voting for the socialist candidate, and it's probably because of some of these immediate reforms that they called for. So some of these reforms included free college education. Since I am a college professor, that is something that really sparks the interest of a lot of my students. Should you start your financial life off in debt? This is something that the American Socialist Party questioned. They called for the improvement of work conditions. Remember who their base would have been: lots of workers, and they need an improvement of these work conditions. You should not have to risk your life in order to provide for your family. They also called for the public ownership of railroads and factories to break up some of these monopolies and to break up some of these trusts. Now, in more ethnically diverse communities, socialism was a lot more popular and it tended to flourish. One, in a lot of like Eastern European countries, for example, socialism wasn't something that was necessarily new, it was more familiar. And again, who and what are they appealing to? Eugene Debs will actually run for president during the election of 1912. He will not win, but he will run. He was a railroad union leader and socialist leader at this time. Um, so, one thing that I discussed, and let me see where we are. Okay, one thing that I also discussed at the beginning of this lecture was persistent labor strife. This is something that the progressive era is, it's something that it's definitely known for. Last chapter, we talked about the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. And one thing that we talked about was how it limited or restricted its membership to skilled workers. Now, why exactly is this problematic that only skilled workers at this time can join the AFL? Well, the problem with that is that it restricts membership to really native born white men. Black people could not be in supervisory positions because this is the era of Jim Crow. So, Black men, Black women were not able to be in supervisory positions. Also, it was more difficult for immigrants to be in supervisory positions or get that skilled work. So, the AFL, unfortunately, a lot of their membership is restricted to native born white men. And so, seeing that there is a gap that needs to be filled. We get the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. The IWW was founded in 1905, and it really tried to mobilize the immigrant factory labor force, as well as the migrant timber and agricultural workers, women, Blacks, Chinese people. They really tried to unite workers that had been really left out and kind of brushed aside by the AFL, as the AFL only represented the most privileged workers. Okay, that's it for part one. I'll see you in a bit with part two of three.